Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Carter. As Dave said, I work for the Pennsylvania Geological Survey. Later this year, I'll actually have my 20-year anniversary with the state, and I wear several hats here in the Pittsburgh area where I live and work. So my day job is with the survey, but I also happen to be the current president of the Potential Gas Committee. So the guys asked me to give you an introduction and talk a little bit about that group and what we do. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today are these 4 bullet items. I'm going to speak to CCUS and tell you why it's important. We're going to talk about what actually constitutes CO2 transport infrastructure and why does it even matter or relate back to CCUS. As Dave mentioned, the survey's been doing carbon storage, carbon sequestration related research for some time, so I'm going to tell you what we know about Pennsylvania's landscape and talk a little bit about what else we need to know to be able to successfully deploy CCUS here in the Commonwealth, in the greater Appalachian Basin area. And then finally, I'll speak to the PGC work that I do. So, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Going on 20 years or so back in time, the Department of Energy, when this became a research topic that they focused some of their time and their funding on, was mainly called carbon sequestration. There wasn't a utilization aspect, a beneficial use aspect, even though, as was mentioned earlier, CO2 enhanced oil recovery has been performed domestically for decades here in the country, and not just out west, in various places across the U.S. So it took some time for the research to mature and frankly the economics to catch up and sort of start to align to the point where DOE and other entities that fund this type of work, at least the desktop aspect of this type of work, will include the utilization, the beneficial use portion of it. So we've got a lot of carbon emission sources, especially here in Pennsylvania. I'll be showing you a map of that, and we'll talk about that. The capture process is something that's, handled, it's been done, it's nothing new either. Utilization, I mentioned CO2 EOR, but there's also projects that have been conducted with enhanced coal bed methane recovery or enhanced gas recovery applications. And whenever you do a project like that, in most situations, you end up with some associated storage, meaning some of the CO2 will stay underground. So you'll hear that term from me today too. The storage aspect is where we're permanently injecting the CO2 at least a half a mile or more beneath our feet. That half a mile depth constraint puts the CO2 in a supercritical kind of fluid gas state that's most efficient for storage purposes. And it's not just the research community, but now state and federal agencies. So the agency to which I belong here in PA, DCNR, understands, and I see more of an embracing of CCS, the storage component in particular. It's needed to meet climate mitigation goals, whatever those specific goals are. This graphic, it's going on 4 years old now, but it's from the IEA, and it talks about what kind of techniques or technologies do we need to employ to get to a 2 degrees Celsius reduction in global temperatures. So no one technology is going to do it. And so, in other words, you can't just switch your fuels and solve the greenhouse gas problem. You can't just use renewables. You've got to throw everything at it, and CCS is a big part, is a notable part of that portfolio of technologies. So as far as Pennsylvania is concerned, the Commonwealth has been involved in the CCUS workspace for 18 years, since 2003. Some of the maps that Perry showed in his presentation just before lunch come from the MRCSP, which would have been the first long-standing partnership that the PA survey was an integral part of. We work with our neighboring states, and the MRCSP was not just the Appalachian Basin, but it was also parts west. So you go through Ohio, the Arches province, into the Michigan Basin, into the eastern half of the Illinois Basin. And that work wrapped up with final reporting that was just released by DOE, final approval state, so that we can release it and share it with everybody earlier this year. The items in green, bold text, those are state level initiatives that the Commonwealth, or DCNR more specifically, have been involved with. So if you were around the region a decade or so ago, you may remember that the state legislature required our agency to look at carbon storage opportunities for the state of Pennsylvania as part of Act 128, or Act 129, excuse me, of 2008. So the CMAG report, which essentially was our Bureau of Forestry's report on what terrestrial sequestration could bring to the table in terms of reducing carbon emissions, was followed on by the Geological Survey's geologic storage technical assessment. Currently, we lead a interagency work group. In other states, a similar model would be maybe called a task force, but in Pennsylvania, Governor Wolf convened, and DCNR leads an interagency work group, and I'll talk a little bit about that. That's in conjunction with our sister agency, DEP, the regulatory body here in Pennsylvania, as well as the DCED, Community Economic Development, that supports workforce and industry here in the state. The other couple projects in between those are also federally funded efforts. We did, believe it or not, a couple years ago, finish an offshore geologic carbon sequestration assessment. So that was pretty illuminating. I'm happy to take some questions on that, but that's a project in and of itself, offshore. And then the Midwest Regional Carbon Initiative, that is the current DOE-funded partnership consortium that is taking a look at the northeastern portion of the U.S. So if we talk about existing infrastructure and CO2 emissions, my inset map here is showing you that the grayed out area, those are the 10 states that were part of that MRCSP partnership. So everything from Michigan and Indiana through, to the Appalachian Basin states and the coastal states of Delaware and Maryland. And that's, the graphic is from the final report that I just mentioned. And essentially, just even if you're looking at power plants, and that's just one type of source, but Pennsylvania has a lot of point source emissions. The existing transport infrastructure we have is just road, rail, and waterways, and you aren't going to solve carbon dioxide reductions just by the existing infrastructure that we have. Power plants are the major source of CO2 emissions here in the state, and they're the big emitters, like more than a million metric tons a year. But we have so many industrial sources, and they cannot decarbonize by switching fuels. They are, as part of their industrial process, creating CO2. CO2 is part of the emission stream. So if we want to keep our industries, and not just keep them, but grow them, we need to be able to pivot and deal with the CO2 emissions, and how do we get CO2 from those point sources to a place where it can be responsibly stored and sequestered. All right, so this is one of the graphics that Perry included. This is, of all the slides that I'll show you today, this is has the most information in it from a technical and even logistical vocabulary standpoint. Pennsylvania's landscape is broad and very diverse. You know, not just from our topography. You know, if you think everything from Philadelphia all the way out to here and points north and northeast, but also the geology beneath our feet. We have multiple physiographic provinces here in Pennsylvania, and the Appalachian Basin, the western part of our state, with all of our sedimentary rock. There are complexities and thicknesses that you don't find necessarily in adjoining states. So given that landscape, I think that it's about time. And fortunately, when I say it's about time that we're talking about infrastructure, you know, what's happening at ground level, where might we need pipelines and businesses to take care of emissions and take them from point to an end disposition in the subsurface. The original funding and all the researchy type mechanisms that brought the topic of CO2 sequestration to the mainstream really did just focus on the geology and maybe the technical aspects, and then you know, they got into a little bit more of supporting the capture technologies and what have you, but everything else, the midstream to downstream, was just not there. So it's about time that there are efforts at the state, regional, and federal level to deal with CO2 infrastructure. So that's what I'll say about that. But Pennsylvania's landscape, like neighboring states, there are opportunities for beneficial use of CO2, whether you're using that CO2 to enhance recovery of methane from a coal seam and advance a longwall mining, whether you're using it into shallow conventional reservoirs for enhanced oil or gas recovery, perhaps even into organic rich shales eventually as a means of, you know, additional recovery of Marcellus shale gas, for example. But as you go deeper, the prospects become more permanent. We're looking at permanent storage, perhaps through stacked reservoirs. Any one layer of rock, especially here in Pennsylvania, is not necessary. We do not have layered cake stratigraphy here. So we don't have just one nice, really thick, laterally extensive, very porous, permeable sandstone that can take CO2. We have to be more mindful about how we characterize our reservoirs and characterize the caprocks to those reservoirs, because they may pinch out, they might have variations in porosity that have to do with geologic history that postdates the deposition of those rocks. So the complexity is such that, you know, multiple reservoirs in different places, you may have to use, you know, more than one to store your CO2. And then the deepest rocks, the lowermost part of the cartoon there, those are some of those rocks, especially the Cambrian age stuff. So right on top of Precambrian basement, those units are least characterized, especially in the deepest parts of the basin. So where we are here now, Washington, Greene County, Fayette County, the depth of basement gets shallower as you move to the north and west of here. So we do have Cambrian and Cambro-Ordovician oil and gas production that tells us, you know, the character of those rocks there, but what are they here? So again, speaking to the lateral variation and characteristics of our potential reservoirs. And the items in red are just the important, what I think are the most important points that anybody who's going to be in carbon management in that business, that fledgling economy, is going to have to solve. You know, maybe not necessarily on their own. It would have to be in concert with perhaps, you know, regulatory agencies, conservation agencies, legal entities, but, you know, matching source to sink is critical. A multi-million ton of CO2 point source per year, you're not necessarily going to put in the Oriskany sandstone in Clinton County. In Perry's situation, the volume, the order of magnitude that they're looking to store annually is maybe 100,000 tons of CO2 a year. So you have to be mindful of that relationship. And certainly here in southwestern PA, active mining, active shale gas development. We do have traditional natural gas storage in some of our Oriskany reservoirs and even some of our Upper Devonian reservoirs in the area, some of which are abandoned, not necessarily active now. You have to coordinate, with different entities if you're going to be doing subsurface activities in the coal areas of Pennsylvania. Pore space ownership and access to that pore space is another thing. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania looked at this in 2009 when we did our statewide assessment. We provided some, an understanding of the lay of the land at that time, but honestly, even from a national level, it's only been in the last few years that you're starting to see more focused consideration and reporting on how you deal with getting access to the right amount of pore space for carbon storage applications. And who owns that? Is it the surface landowner? Is it the mineral rights owner? Is it a national resource that gets taken by eminent domain? Or is it something else? So coordination is important. Okie doke. So we've got several activities that we're currently working on at the survey, and the items in gold are the ones that I'm going to speak to today. I will just mention that, the interagency work group that I'm going to introduce you to now is dealing with a lot of that education and outreach that Perry spoke to in his presentation, and the two projects that we're helping to shepherd along here in the state of PA include that natural gas synthesis plant in Clinton County, as well as Consol's Coal First Power Plant project, which is slated to begin soon, and it's here in Washington County, right near the West Virginia Panhandle. All right, I'll show you a map, this next one. Okay, so if we look at a map of PA, essentially what I wanted to point out there was the different pastel colors, whether they're yellow or salmon color or blue. Those are just, showing you the geographic distribution of those different layers of oil and gas reservoirs. So those geologic formations at different depths and where they exist. The two stars point out the Key State project in north central PA and the Consol Coal First project, which is pending for here in southwestern PA. The interagency work group. So again, we have these three agencies, and we actually started collaborating on a monthly basis almost 2 years ago. It was October of 2019 when the Wolf administration agreed with us that, hey, these three agencies should be tackling matters around carbon storage, and not just, climate action plan or RGGI or any of those other things that are, at least in some way or form tied to, trying to solve carbon emissions. We have executed an interagency MOU amongst ourselves to galvanize this collaboration we're enjoying now, well past the Wolf administration. So we intend to be, we're not going to give up on this. And our collaborative work, I just list a few things. Again, DEP is in the revision process of their climate action plan that they do every few years. So that's one example of stuff that we get to collaborate on. This regional transport infrastructure build out, though, is probably the most important thing about my presentation that will be, of interest to you guys out there in the audience. So let me talk about that. The Memorandum of Understanding for a Regional Transport Infrastructure Action Plan. This was a endeavor initiated by the Great Plains Institute, which has for nearly 20 years promoted the need and the wherewithal, from all aspects for carbon storage and getting the United States to a point where we are a carbon neutral country or carbon negative country. So they had approached us as they approached several states. Pennsylvania, if you look at the state flags, I mean, that's the current accounting of the states who have signed on. So Kansas, Louisiana, Maryland, Montana, Oklahoma, PA, and Wyoming. So PA and Maryland are the only mid-Atlantic states in this very short list of signatory states. And I think that speaks to the importance that these administrations place on the science and the science that you have to understand below ground, as well as the stuff that you need to plan for above ground, infrastructure and otherwise. I'm not going to read the bullet points, but that is a synthesis of what the MOU is, designed to do. We really do think that it's an and conversation. The concept of developing and using our own domestic natural resources, creating high-paying jobs, and reducing our carbon emissions, those are not mutually exclusive. It is truly an and conversation, and they each can feed on one another. So it can benefit everything if we do this right and we do this together. The collaborative mechanism of the signatory states is that we're meeting every month, and we are writing an action plan. So again, in a year's time, we started this October 1st of this past fall, and you see from my little red text there, the plan itself will be out, later this fall. So in a 12-month time period, this is going to be a paper study, admittedly. However, it's going to focus based on talking with people who are engaged on this subject or who do business in carbon storage or related industries, or who are interested in that, getting into that business. What do we need to do? What has to be part of the lift to make a carbon storage economy with proper infrastructure? And so the action plan will have recommendations for federal, regional, and even possibly state levels on those important topics of, access to pore space, matching sources to sinks, the concepts of pipeline networks and storage hubs. All right. And again, storage hubs being the answer to those companies out there who say, hey, I've got a CO2 source, but I'm not in a sedimentary basin. I'm not even near the Appalachian Basin. How do I sequester? How do I store my CO2? I don't have that beneath my feet. Well, you're likely in a situation where you would need to have it in a pipeline, and then it goes down to some other location where storage is possible and practical. Even as we've been working on this MOU action plan related task, the SCALE Act was reintroduced into Congress, and you may have seen this in the news. It was like in the middle of March. So it's been there. It's endorsed by several folks on both sides of the aisle. But this would be an additional way to help fund through loans and grants to those that are looking to build out, and need capital to consider building that infrastructure, the combination of pipelines and geologic storage hubs. So with that infrastructure, that's going to bump up the ability for us to scale up CCUS. And another big part of it has to do with additional funding to the EPA, which manages the underground injection control program. So earlier we had a question on class 6 injection wells. There are 6 different classes of injection wells in the UIC program, and the CO2 wells are the number 6, the class 6. UIC programs are very money and personnel intensive, as I understand it. Pennsylvania is not a primacy state. We have not accepted primacy for the UIC program. So what does that mean for operators? If you're going to permit an injection well here in Pennsylvania, you not only have to go through a permitting process with the DEP folks, Bureau of Oil and Gas Management more specifically, but also you have to go through EPA. Other states that have accepted primacy get funding and support to streamline that process and bring it into a more cohesive program. And there's a website here. Again, my slides will be shared so you can read more about it through the links. Okay. The MRCI, or Midwest Regional Carbon Initiative Project, this is the current federally funded partnership type project that the Department of Energy's Fossil Energy Group has funded. So if you look at the inset map, now we're looking not just at the Appalachian Basin, Illinois Basin, and Michigan Basin, and arches in between, but we've moved our partnership out to the west even farther, and we've gone up and included all of the New England states, and the pale blue polygon off the coast, that's the Mid-Atlantic U.S. offshore area that we characterized through that other project I mentioned that wrapped up a couple years ago. So this initiative has 20 of the United States, 50 states, as well as the offshore area. And our focus is for responsible consideration of siting and developing infrastructure, pipeline and storage hubs. So sites that would have, theoretically, a nesting of injection wells, perhaps at different reservoirs at different depths, and it would take, CO2 from the pipeline, and other, as users are putting stuff into the pipeline, that the whole pipeline management would be kind of a symphony of getting sources, regardless of their volumes, into a situation where they're not emitting that CO2 anymore, but it's being sent down the line, whether it's for an end user that can make carbon products with them, the utilization component, or storage through one of the storage hubs. And stack potential is still important. 2017 emissions are shown in that table on the right. This is just to show, for the northeastern quadrant of the country, what types of CO2 emitters we have. Power plants are, still by far the largest percentage of the emissions, but coal-fired power plants are being retired and taken offline. They're being replaced by gas-fired power plants or other projects, especially here in Pennsylvania. The steel and cement and glass industries that have provided jobs for so many generations, my family included, they are not going to be decarbonizing just by switching their fuels, as I said earlier. So the industries and their emissions are integral to know where and how much they're emitting, so that we can help them reduce their footprint without putting them out of business. So if I had to look at this in a summary type way for you folks, it would be this. We've got an understanding at the federal level in terms of where major emitters are, where the inset map there is just showing you different carbon emissions and pipelines that are, in some cases, connecting sources together. The middle picture is that regional, Midwest regional area that the Pennsylvania Survey is currently working on a project with, and then zooming down to the state level, where our geologic resources are largely in the western part of the state, but some of the northern tier counties too. And it's at those three levels, federal, regional, and state, that are going to be needed. Each has a part to play if we're going to have an economy-wide deployment of carbon capture. And the items in green text, those are the things that are the current activities. So at the federal level, that SCALE Act would help the complementary policy portfolio that will be needed at the federal level. The feds are funding projects to some extent, you know, carbon storage projects. Our regional initiative is one of 4 that DOE is providing funding for right now. At the regional level, Pennsylvania is one of those transport infrastructure MOU states. So later this year, our findings will come out, and those will be guidelines that hopefully will drive policy to, you know, support carbon storage and pipeline infrastructure. And our interagency work group is how we're going to push things up, you know, and keep things moving at the state level. So in terms of the CCUS I wanted to talk about today, there are some take-home points. These technologies have been performed for a number of years, and they're proven, you know, domestically as well as globally. Most people will agree, you know, whether you're a think tank or you're an everyday citizen, that, you know, CCUS is an important component and has to be used, has to be part of the mix to help decarbonize the domestic economy by 2050. PA has a lot of geologic resources. Where we're at here, you know, we're looking in excess of 10,000 feet, maybe even closer to 20,000 feet of sedimentary rock cover. We have a lot of resources that may be good for beneficial use or for permanently storing our CO2, but, you know, I would caution, every site still has to prove its own storage reservoirs. So you will still have to do a certain amount of science at your location. Perry will have to do it in Clinton County. Consol will have to do it in Washington County, and that's part of the business. So we do have to do a better job characterizing the deepest parts of Pennsylvania, because by and large, the information we know and have evaluated for Pennsylvania's subsurface geology comes from the oil and gas activity, you know, since Drake Wells in 1859. And it's not like, you know, we have access to fancy seismic data everywhere we would like it, or test wells, core wells, those types of things will be needed at a site. And the coordination piece definitely is a big part of it too. All right, so that's all I was going to say about my day job, the CCUS. How about I take questions on that now before we talk about PGC? So if there are any. Yes?
So I feel like I want to be in the ground, buried by the time this comes to me. So if I was enterprising enough and I wanted to put CO2 in the ground tomorrow, is there a system and a process, procedures, and staffing to look at that and approve it?
In a manner of speaking, yes, because the DOE, by virtue of those regional carbon sequestration partnerships that ended anywhere between 2015 and 2019, there are best practice manuals, 6 or 7 of them. So those would be your, you know, instruction manual, but they can be very complex depending on what part of the country, you know, what specific type of, you know, sequestration approach that you're taking. Another thing I will say too is, because it's, you know, geology doesn't care where the point sources are, and people build their industries where they build their industries, you know, not necessarily are thinking about where the subsurface storage opportunities are.
But specifically in Pennsylvania? Specifically
in Pennsylvania.
You have to go through EPA to get us 6.
Yes, I mean, so injecting CO2 requires a class 6 injection well. And yes, you will have to apply through EPA. They've improved the process a little bit, but it's still, you know, it could be a 3-year proposition. Yeah, so it's not immediate. Now that's, you know, in contrast, a class 5 geothermal well through EPA, that is typically turned around in 180 days. So And then to compound the fact that Pennsylvania, the DEP has not accepted primacy for implementing the program. There's been no attempt to streamline. But, you know, Louisiana's seeking primacy, and there are other states beyond North Dakota that, you know, so I see it coming, but, you know, I hope you live a long life. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that there's different ways you could go with injection as far as who owns the injection area. Is there anything that's leading? Is it leading that it's going to be leased ground, or it's going to be eminent domain? Is there one thing that you think might come out on top?
Right. Well, when I mean, as far as the research that Pennsylvania has done on the topic, the prevailing rule or understanding is the surficial landowner owns the pore space that would be injected to.
Yes.
So that is, and now that's counterintuitive to me as a petroleum geologist, because I think, okay, if I own my subsurface rights, the pore is part of that rock to me. I mean, that's where the good stuff is, that, you know, that we're taking out of the ground. What's not there, the pore, should still belong to me, even with the, you know, because I see it as more of a whole rock thing. But yes, once the stuff is extracted, the prevailing knowledge is that surficial landowner, at least here in Pennsylvania, now it could be, you know, other states are handling it differently. You know, Wyoming, you know, you can read up on them. They've taken over pore space for carbon storage through like an eminent domain type thing in legislation. So that's, yes.
I wanted to make a comment. The pore space needs to be owned by the surface owner, because the contractual relationship between the surface owner and the developer is a function of removing the fungible minerals, not the sandstone, quartz, granite, and what have you.
Depends on the term of the lease. That depends on what the lease says.
Well, I'm talking about fossil fuels.
Yeah.
If somebody has an agreement to extract the fossil fuels from below the surface, I don't see how that person could own the pore space, that's all.
I don't either.
And then, that's just my comment. And I did have, would you please ask this lady that carbolic acid question?
Carbonic acid.
Carbonic?
My concern is that carbonic acid is a weak acid,
Yeah.
and it's carbon dioxide and water. So we know that there's water down there, but it's highly mineralized.
Yes, it's briny.
So is there a need for testing of carbonic acid that you're going to create knowingly? Inject carbonic acid into potentially calcium carbonate zones, or hurt your cement, your Portland cement? Is there any thought or concern, or am I just off in the intro?
Yeah, so you know, the 2+ decades of carbon storage projects, whether they're demo to, you know, full-scale implementation type projects, that's a non-issue. I understand what you're asking, but the fact is, I mean, if you were looking at very shallow, put it this way, if I was trying, if I could even inject CO2 in the shallow Bradford oil field,
Right.
which is in, you know, essentially the oil field reservoir, the oil reservoir is
Right.
where the groundwater, the shallow groundwater is. There's no separation there. They're one and the same. That might be a concern, but we're talking about supercritical injection of CO2, so you need to be at least 2,500, 2,600 feet below ground to hit those pressure temperature requirements. And what's more, the rocks that we are talking about, you know, whether they're Devonian or older, they are they're caprocks. They're not leaky reservoirs. I wouldn't expect a non-brine water source to interact with the injected CO2
So
once
there's
in
no
place.
danger of losing the capstone from dissolving? There's no danger?
No, in our caprocks in Pennsylvania here are more the shales and the silty shales. Does that help you? Does that answer your question? And so to your point about the pore space, my counter argument would be, well, how do you know when all of that hydrocarbon has been taken out? Because we know within the pore space, there's an argument to be made for what's recoverable and what's not.
Yes.
And have you completely swept out all of the oil, gas, ethane, whatever products are down there? So some states are seeing that argument. I mean, when you call it completely vacated of the mineral resource that had been leased and not. So
Then the space becomes
it would still belong to me.
a commercial asset.
It was, yeah. And then at that point then, would the state come in and maybe take eminent domain control? Yeah, I don't know.
So you could go
I'm not-
and get a permit for a 6 injection well. And what your permit is they're gonna come back and give you your injection pressures. So they'll tell you.
You have to model and
You have to
do
model
it, yeah,
that. And then you have to monitor
yes.
the loss of pressure to make sure you keep your permit.
Yes, and there are other means of, operation and O&M and monitoring that you'll have to do during that. It's not just, but pressure is the first main thing. I mean, and we know what our reservoir pressures are typically just from the oil and gas activity. And so you don't want to go above that really. And
Do you think EPA would allow an abandoned or risking well to be just lined with 2 7/8?
It may very well be, and I know anecdotally that
Probably packed.
those that are seeking solutions with carbon storage, repurposing existing wells, as long as they don't have any major integrity issues, or a bad history, that is something that,
Cheaper option.
yes, and you're not starting from scratch either. Yes.
We build compressor stations over in Michigan where they're pumping gas, storing gas into the salt wells and things.
Okay.
There's one in Ohio that I don't think is salt related. But can give me an idea on elevations, like where would salt well be, storage areas, where would they be in Ohio? And I know there's some in Pennsylvania as well. And then when you're talking about how are those even deeper, they have to be deeper?
Yeah, although we've looked at bedded salt formations here in our basin, as well as siliciclastic reservoirs and organic rich shales, and just different rock types for potential storage applications, mined rock caverns for potential storage applications. Here in the tri-state area, those salina bedded salt fields are in the 5,300 to 6,700 foot or so depth range, and a typical usage for salt cavern storage is the brine compensation aspect of it, and DEP doesn't seem to be very keen on open impoundments for that. So I know that that's been anecdotally, that's what I've been told by industry, that they haven't pursued that for whether it's NGLs or anything else. I think CO2, for CO2 storage, bedded salt is probably not the way to go. Hydrogen storage, yeah, it'd be worth it for that, because anytime you can create your own cavern and engineer it, and then get the monitors, or however you're gonna mic it up, so to speak, then for those high value products, the hydrogen and the NGLs, that's a better way to go. CO2 is more akin to you know, a traditional natural gas storage type proposition, at least in my head. Do I have a couple minutes, because I have the potential gas committee stuff? Okay, so, you know, one of the things that Dave and Drew wanted me to mention was to talk about the potential gas committee. Now, your association, I'm guessing at least some of you are familiar with the PGC, but if you aren't, you know, bear with me, I've got 3 slides for you. This is a volunteer group of oil and gas professionals. We're affiliated with the Colorado School of Mines in Golden. Every 2 years, we assess the natural gas supply of the entire U.S. So that includes not just the traditional conventional stuff, but unconventional shales and coal bed methane. We have different regions that are basically, you know, dictated by geophysical provinces. As an example, you know, I work the Atlantic region, which is essentially the Appalachian Basin, the Black Warrior Basin, and you know, all the way down to Florida. A lot of those areas are not necessarily active now, but we consider a lot of different data when we do our assessments, like produced area, how big is the remaining acreage. We talk about probable, possible, speculative groupings of gas, and we come up with a lay of the land, so to speak, for how much the U.S. would be expected to have. And the thing about the PGC reports, so right now we're working on the 2018 to 2020 report. It'll come out later this year, probably August, September. And we usually do a release down in Washington, D.C. at the at the AGA offices down there. We do use a combination, depending on what region you're talking about, you know, there might be some confidential data involved, so plays and data are aggregated together. So that's one thing. You're not going to get specific natural gas assessments for the Marcellus per se, here in our basin, or the Utica. They're aggregated, and we report them in a couple of ways. There's arithmetic tabulations of most likely. So most likely being, hey, if you're going to be planning pipelines in certain parts of the country or your work area, whatever your region is, what do you need to be considering, you know, a few years out? Do you have to add to your capacity or not? You know, what's coming down the line? The aggregated mean values is when, or the data is a way of massaging the data for statistical comparisons with other groups that do natural gas assessments. And our executive director, Alexei Milkov, does the stats on it. So the inset graphic is just showing you in a flowchart kind of way how we look at the gas resource for the country. So, you know, whatever total resource we have here in the US, that's at the top. Not all of that's going to be recoverable, right? But of the part that's recoverable, we've discovered a lot of it, but there's probably some stuff that we haven't discovered. And then, you know, from there you break down into levels of confidence with respect to, you know, is it confirmed? We have a good handle on it to the point where it's either a proved reserve ready to produce, or it's already been produced. And then for the unconfirmed, you know, there's, again, as you consider extending the activities out from the areas where you have your best data control, you know, what's a new field or a new pool. And when you add those things all up, the proved reserves, which actually come from the EIA, the Energy Information Administration of DOE, and the PGC, those two things together will generate a number for the future supply of natural gas. And potentialgas.org is the website there. For those of you who say, well, yeah, there's resource assessments and I read different numbers and why are they different and what's going on here. If I had to compare the PGC work to what EIA does and what the USGS, US Geological Survey does, this is how it would break out. Essentially, both EIA and the Potential Gas Committee are looking at empirical, real data, from people who are working in the industry or in a state agency like me who is familiar with the industry and has access to public data. The USGS, they tend to do more probabilistic modeling type approaches to come up with their numbers, and both the survey and EIA look at oil as well as gas, but PGC just focuses on gas. And you can see there the focus of the resource. PGC is only looking at what's technically recoverable given the current technology you guys have available to you right now. Both discovered, what we know about, and what we have yet to know about, the undiscovered resources. We do our reporting every 2 years, and that feeds into the annual comparison with the EIA numbers. USGS assessments, if you read on the Marcellus or the Utica or any of the other major gas prone rocks here in our basin, it's as deemed necessary based on well, there's enough data to do this now, or there's a particular interest in this play. So their reporting is a little bit more sporadic. So I guess that's all I'll say about that. And we will be, as I said, our 2020 report's coming out later this year, so be on the lookout for that release. And I have my contact information here. I'll be here through at least part of the happy hour, so I'm happy to talk with you more or take more questions.
Can we ask a couple of
Just one, okay.
So I was curious about the funding for the PGC, and are there members of the PGC that have the technical ability to interpret seismic data?
The PGC is a volunteer organization, so our time is, we're not paid. We step up to the plate and do the work for free. Now, Dr. Milkov is a paid professor at School of Mines, so that's his day job, and he oversees us. And because by virtue of the fact that a lot of these people are in the oil and gas industry, yes, there are people that know how to interpret seismic.